Ethan Cole tightened his grip on the steering wheel as the storm turned the empty highway ahead into a gray blur. In less than 50 minutes, he and his K-9 partner, Valor, were supposed to be sitting in front of the review board at Naval Base Kitsap. It was the meeting they had spent nearly 2 years fighting to reach. The final step, the one that could send them back to SEAL Team 5. Missing it wasn't really an option. Several members of the board had flown in from across the country just for that morning. The schedule had been locked for weeks. Outside, rain swept across the coastal forests of Washington, turning the empty road ahead into a gray blur. Then Valor suddenly stood up in the back seat. His ears went forward. His eyes locked on something through the windshield. Ethan followed his gaze. An elderly woman was walking alone along the shoulder of the road. No umbrella, no jacket. Just a frail figure struggling against the wind and rain. She stumbled once, then again. For a moment, Ethan kept driving. Because sometimes life gives you only seconds to choose between what you've worked for and who needs you right now. If you were in his place, what would you have done? Would you keep driving toward the career you sacrificed your youth to build, or stop for a stranger you might never see again? Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from and what choice you would make. If this kind of story speaks to you, we'd be honored to have you subscribe. At 7:13 on a cold June morning, Ethan Cole looked at the clock glowing on the dashboard of his black Ford pickup and felt his hands tighten around the steering wheel. Rain moved across the windshield in hard silver sheets, blurring the cedar trees along the road until the whole world seemed made of water, shadow, and the low gray breath of the Hood Canal. June rain on the Kitsap Peninsula was usually soft, the kind that misted over ferry docks and coffee shop windows, but this storm had teeth. It pushed sideways through the pines, bent the roadside grass flat, and brought a chill that belonged to November. Valor knew it too. The German shepherd lay across the back seat with his head lifted, black and tan coat catching the dim light from passing road signs, ears moving at every sound the storm tried to hide. He was 7 years old, heavy through the chest, disciplined in the way only a working K-9 could be, but his amber eyes had been restless since they left Poulsbo before sunrise. Ethan had noticed. He noticed everything. That was part of the problem. For nearly 2 years, Ethan had trained himself back toward the life he thought he had lost. 35 years old, former Navy SEAL, K-9 handler, a man whose body still woke before dawn even when there was nowhere to report. He had passed the physical evaluation in March, the medical clearance in April, and the psychological review 3 weeks ago with a woman in a Navy blazer who had watched him carefully over the rim of her glasses before, saying, "You're not the same man you were before the incident, Ethan." That may be a good thing. He had not known what to do with that. Today was the final step. The in-person review near Naval Base Kitsap had been on the calendar for weeks. Men and women from Virginia, California, and Hawaii had flown in because the board wanted to see him face-to-face before making its recommendation. If they approved him, Ethan and Valor could return to SEAL Team 5 in time to support Operation Silent Tide, a humanitarian response mission in the Pacific after a violent storm had torn through island communities. It was supposed to be a way back, not to the old Ethan, maybe that man was gone, but to usefulness, to structure, to the clean, difficult mercy of having a mission again. The wipers knocked back and forth with a tired rubber squeak. Valor shifted. Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror. Easy, boy. Valor did not settle. The road outside Port Gamble was nearly empty, bordered by dark firs, wet ditches, and the occasional mailbox leaning like it had been arguing with the weather for years. A logging truck passed in the opposite lane, throwing a wave of dirty water across Ethan's windshield. For 2 seconds, he saw nothing. Then the glass cleared, and memory came with it. Florida, heat on white pavement. A sheriff's deputy standing under the flat afternoon sun with his hat in both hands. A phone call that had come through a satellite line while Ethan was in Syria, the delay in the signal making every word feel less real. His parents had been driving home from a late church supper outside Pensacola when a drunk driver crossed the center line. His father died before the ambulance arrived. His mother died at the hospital. Ethan had been 12,000 miles away with sand in his boots and a rifle within reach, listening as a chaplain explained funeral arrangements he could not attend. The connection kept cutting in and out. At one point, the screen froze on his mother's framed photograph beside the casket, her smile trapped in a flicker of bad military Wi-Fi. He remembered sitting on an ammo crate afterward, unable to cry because 6 men were waiting for him to make a decision before daylight. So he made one. That was what he had always done. The dashboard clock changed to 7:14. Ethan drew in a slow breath and forced his mind back to the road. Valor suddenly rose. Not a lazy shift, not discomfort. The dog came up fast, paws braced against the back seat, body rigid, ears forward. His gaze locked through the rain toward the right shoulder. Ethan followed the line of sight. At first he saw only movement, a pale shape near the ditch, then a person. An elderly woman was walking along the edge of the road, one hand pressed to her chest, the other stretched slightly outward as if touching the rain itself for balance. Her gray coat hung dark and soaked around her thin frame. White hair clung to her face. She wore no proper rain gear, and her steps had the loose, uneven rhythm of someone whose body was no longer fully obeying. She stumbled, caught herself, kept walking. Ethan's foot eased off the gas. The truck rolled past her slowly. He looked ahead. The review board was waiting. The schedule was tight. This road was not deserted forever. Someone else would come along. A county worker, a local, a deputy, someone with less riding on the next 45 minutes. Valor whined. Low. Short, unmistakable. Ethan kept both hands on the wheel. Not now, he said, though he was not sure whether he meant the dog, the woman, or the old ache rising under his ribs. The woman disappeared in the side mirror, shrinking into the wet gray distance. Ethan drove another 100 yards, then 200. Valor turned fully around in the back seat and stared through the rear window. Ethan saw it in the mirror. The old woman had stopped walking. She stood bent beneath the rain, one hand against a roadside post, head lowered as if she were trying to remember how to breathe. Her knees dipped once. Not a fall, but the warning before one. Ethan's jaw tightened. His mother had been 72 when she died. She used to stand on the porch in Florida storms and call him stubborn for refusing an umbrella. She had mailed him socks every deployment, even to places where he could not tell her the address. The last voicemail she ever left him was still on an old phone in a drawer, unheard for 6 years because he knew the sound of her voice would undo something he had worked hard to keep tied shut. Valor whined again. This time Ethan listened. He checked the road, hit the brakes, and pulled onto the shoulder hard enough for gravel to snap beneath the tires. For a moment he sat there, rain hammering the roof, engine ticking, review board waiting somewhere beyond the trees. Then he shifted into reverse. The truck backed down the road with slow, careful urgency, hazard lights blinking red against the rain. When he reached the woman, Ethan put the truck in park and stepped out before doubt could gather itself. Cold rain struck his face. "Mom," he called, keeping his voice low. "Can you hear me?" The woman lifted her head. Her eyes were pale blue, unfocused at first, then startled by the sight of him. She tried to straighten. "I'm all right," she said, though her voice shook badly enough to betray her. Ethan moved closer but left space between them. Valor watched from the open rear window, silent now, his whole body attentive. "You're soaked through," Ethan said. "How long have you been walking?" She blinked, looked down the road, then back at him. "I thought there was a gas station closer." "There isn't." A small, embarrassed breath escaped her, almost a laugh, but too tired to become one. That would explain a few things. Her hands trembled. The humor cost her something. Ethan opened the passenger door and turned the heat higher. "Come on, let's get you out of the rain." The woman hesitated, still holding on to whatever dignity the storm had not taken. "I don't want to trouble you." "You already did," Ethan said gently. "Now let me make it useful." That earned the faintest look of surprise from her, and then slowly she allowed him to guide her toward the truck. Her arm felt cold through the wet sleeve. Too cold. Valor shifted backward as she climbed in, giving her space without command. The woman looked toward the dog, and for a second her expression softened. "Well," she whispered, shivering as Ethan closed the door. "Aren't you a serious gentleman?" Valor blinked once. Ethan got behind the wheel, pulled a folded emergency blanket from the console, and handed it to her. "What's your name, Mom?" "Eleanor," she said, gathering the blanket around her shoulders. "Eleanor Brooks. I'm Ethan. That's Valor." "Valor," she repeated softly as if the name had weight. "That's a good name." The heater blew lukewarm air that smelled faintly of dust and old coffee. Ethan checked the clock again. 7:21. He should have been thinking about the board. Instead, he was watching Eleanor's hands tremble against the silver blanket. "Eleanor," he said, easing the truck back onto the road, "where were you trying to go this morning?" She closed her eyes briefly, embarrassed and exhausted. "A doctor's appointment. My heart doctor. My old Taurus quit on me back there, and my phone died before I could call anyone. I thought I could walk far enough to get help." In this rain, my husband used to say I had more pride than sense. Ethan glanced at Valor in the mirror. "Sounds like he knew you." That brought a thin smile to her face, small but real. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the truck cutting through the wet road towards Silverdale, where the hospital lights would be warmer than the sky. Eleanor slowly turned her head toward him. "And you?" she asked. "Where were you going in weather like this?" Ethan kept his eyes on the road ahead. The wipers moved. Valor listened. After a moment, Ethan answered quietly, "To a place that could decide the rest of my life." The truck rolled through the rain towards Silverdale, while water streamed off the hood in silver ribbons. Eleanor sat quietly beneath the emergency blanket, her shoulders still shaking from the cold. The heater had begun warming the cab, but it would take time to undo what several miles of rain and wind had done to a 76-year-old body. Outside, the forests of western Washington slid past in muted shades of green and gray. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Eleanor glanced down at the blanket wrapped around her knees. "I suppose this is the part where you tell me how foolish I was." Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "I wasn't planning on it." A small smile appeared. "My husband would've." "What happened?" "My car died." She looked out the passenger window. "Old Ford Taurus, 23 years old. I keep promising people I'll replace it." Rain tapped softly against the glass. "I was headed to Jefferson Healthcare. Heart checkup." Ethan nodded. "Routine, every 6 months. And when the car quit, I called roadside assistance." She gave a faint shrug. The phone battery had other plans. After that, she explained how she had waited nearly half an hour before deciding to walk. A gas station appeared much closer on the map than it turned out to be in real life. By the time the rain intensified, she was already too far from the car and too stubborn to turn back. The explanation sounded exactly like something a determined widow might do. The kind of mistake people made when they were used to solving problems alone. 20 minutes later, they pulled beneath the emergency entrance canopy at St. Michael Medical Center. A nurse took one look at Eleanor and immediately pushed a wheelchair toward the truck. The next hour disappeared into forms, questions, blood pressure readings, and hurried conversations between medical staff. Valor remained close the entire time. His leash stayed loose, his attention did not. The German Shepherd followed Ethan through the hallways with the quiet discipline of an animal who had spent years working in environments where mistakes carried consequences. A doctor eventually arrived. Dr. Stephen Harper, 54 years old, thin glasses, coffee stain on the cuff of his white coat, the kind of physician who looked as though he had worked through more nights than he cared to remember. He reviewed Eleanor's chart and then stepped into the hallway. "You brought her in at the right time." Ethan folded his arms. "How bad was it?" "Not critical." The doctor paused. Fortunately, Ethan waited. Mild hypothermia, dehydration, exhaustion. Her body temperature had already dropped below where I'd like to see it. The doctor glanced toward the room. Another hour in those conditions would have created a much more serious conversation. The hallway grew quiet. Somewhere down the corridor, a cart rattled across the tile floor. Ethan looked through the partially open door toward Eleanor's room. She was sitting upright now, wrapped in hospital blankets, speaking with a nurse. For the first time that morning, she looked safe. A nurse approached carrying intake paperwork. Several sections required information Eleanor couldn't remember. Vehicle location, emergency contacts, medical history, medication schedules. The nurse asked if family members could help. Eleanor looked down at the paper. A long moment passed. "My husband passed away 10 years ago." The nurse nodded gently. "Children?" "No." The answer was simple. Matter of fact. Years of practice had smoothed the sharp edges from the words. The nurse offered a sympathetic smile before moving on to another patient. Ethan remained where he was. Something about the exchange settled heavily in his chest. Not because it was unusual, because it wasn't. He had met too many people who carried entire lives by themselves. An hour later, Eleanor's condition had improved. Her hands no longer shook. Color had returned to her face. Valor had settled beside her bed, his head resting across his paws while nurses occasionally stopped to admire him. One elderly volunteer carrying magazines paused outside the room. "That's the calmest dog I've ever seen," Eleanor smiled. "He seems to know exactly where he's supposed to be." The volunteer laughed. "Most people don't." When Ethan finally checked his phone, the screen lit up with a string of missed notifications. The first voicemail had arrived more than an hour earlier. Then another. Then another. The messages continued down the screen. Calls from the evaluation center. Calls from administrative staff. Messages requesting updates. Questions asking where he was. The weight in his stomach returned instantly. Eleanor noticed the change in his face. "Something wrong?" He looked toward her. For a second, he considered giving a vague answer. Instead, he told the truth. "I've got somewhere I should have been." She studied him carefully. "The important place?" Ethan nodded. A trace of guilt appeared in her expression. "You should go. The doctor said you're stable." "Then stop standing around and go." The firmness in her voice surprised him. It also reminded him of someone, his mother. Ethan helped adjust the blanket around her shoulders before stepping back. "If they discharge you before I call, don't try walking anywhere." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Yes, sir. That's not a joke." "I know." A faint smile returned. "Thank you, Ethan." He gave a single nod, then left. The rain had nearly stopped by the time he reached Naval Base Kitsap. Clouds drifted apart over the highway, allowing thin shafts of sunlight to break through. The timing felt almost cruel. When Ethan parked outside the evaluation building, several vehicles were already gone. Inside, the reception area looked unusually quiet. A woman at the front desk immediately recognized him. Her expression told him everything before she spoke. They waited as long as they could. Ethan stood still for a moment, then asked where Commander Mercer was. A few minutes later, he found him inside a conference room that now sat mostly empty. Several water bottles remained on the table. Folders had been stacked neatly. A projector screen still glowed blue against the wall. The meeting had clearly ended recently. Commander Daniel Mercer listened without interrupting while Ethan explained what had happened. The roadside encounter, the hospital, Eleanor's condition, the paperwork, everything. Mercer leaned back in his chair when the explanation ended. "I would have stopped too." The words landed harder than Ethan expected. For a moment, he thought there might still be hope. Then Mercer slid a calendar toward him. "The problem isn't your reason." Ethan looked down. "The problem is logistics." One board member had already boarded a flight to Norfolk. Another needed to report back to Coronado. A third had commitments in Hawaii later that evening. Weeks of scheduling had gone into assembling the group. The earliest replacement date sat 3 weeks away. 3 weeks. Operation Silent Tide would deploy in 2. The realization settled between them. Mercer didn't need to explain the rest. Ethan already understood. The mission was gone. The opportunity he had spent nearly 2 years working toward was gone with it. By the time he reached home, darkness had begun settling over the trees surrounding his property outside Poulsbo. The rain returned after sunset. Lighter this time, steady, almost gentle. Ethan carried a cup of black coffee into the garage and sat down on an old wooden stool. A pressed Navy uniform hung inside a garment bag against the wall. Nearby sat a storage container filled with deployment patches, photographs, and equipment he hadn't touched in months. Valor stretched out on the concrete floor beside him. The dog sighed once and closed his eyes. Neither moved for a long time. Rain tapped softly on the roof. The garage smelled faintly of cedar, motor oil, and old canvas. Ethan stared at the uniform hanging in front of him. He wasn't angry at Eleanor. He wasn't angry at the hospital. He wasn't angry at Mercer. Life had simply forced 2 important things into the same morning, and he had chosen one. Hours passed. The coffee grew cold. Outside, the rain continued. Inside the garage, a single question kept returning. If that morning happened again, would he still stop? The first few days after the canceled evaluation felt strangely empty. Ethan still woke at 5:30 every morning. He still ran the same route through the woods behind his property outside Poulsbo. He still fed Valor at exactly the same time and maintained the routines that had carried him through deployments, recovery programs, and long months of uncertainty. The habits remained. The purpose behind them seemed harder to find. Each morning, messages appeared in the unit group chat. Flight schedules, equipment manifests, travel updates, photos from staging areas. One teammate posted a picture of cargo pallets being loaded onto a military transport aircraft in Hawaii. Another shared a weather briefing for the Pacific. Operation Silent Tide was moving forward. Without him, Ethan read every message. His thumb occasionally hovered above the keyboard. Nothing was ever sent. By Friday afternoon, the conversation had shifted toward deployment preparations. By Sunday, several members of the team were already traveling. Valor seemed to notice the change. The dog spent more time watching Ethan than usual. He followed him from room to room, even when there was no reason to move. One rainy evening, Ethan found himself standing in the garage again. The same uniform still hung inside the garment bag. The same patches sat inside the storage container nearby, a life waiting behind a zipper. He closed the garage door and walked back into the house. The silence followed him. Tuesday arrived with clear skies for the first time in more than a week. Sunlight filtered through the evergreens surrounding the property. The air smelled faintly of wet cedar and salt drifting inland from Puget Sound. Ethan poured coffee into a travel mug and reached for his truck keys. Valor was already waiting near the front door. Nothing unusual about that. Then Ethan opened the door. Valor stepped outside, walked directly to the truck, and sat beside the driver's door. Ethan frowned. "You want a ride?" The dog remained exactly where he was. A minute passed. Then another. Finally, Ethan looked toward the road. A memory surfaced. An elderly woman wrapped in a silver emergency blanket. A hospital room. A quiet voice thanking him. He stared at Valor. The German Shepherd stared back. 20 minutes later, they were driving toward Port Gamble. The town sat along the shoreline like something preserved from another century. Old buildings overlooked the water. Fishing boats drifted in the harbor. American flags moved lazily in the breeze outside storefronts. Eleanor Brooks lived in a small white house several blocks uphill from the waterfront. A blue mailbox stood beside the driveway. The front garden looked slightly overgrown. Ethan knocked once. The door opened almost immediately. For a second, Eleanor simply stared. Then her entire face changed. "Well, look at that." Her smile widened. "I was beginning to think I'd imagined both of you." Valor slipped past Ethan and walked inside as if he had already been invited. Eleanor laughed. "Apparently the dog remembers me. He remembers everyone. Good." She looked at Ethan. "I'd hate to be forgettable." The house smelled faintly of cinnamon, old books, and coffee. Photographs covered several shelves. Many featured a broad-shouldered Marine in different stages of life. Young, middle-aged, gray-haired, always smiling. Thomas Brooks. Eleanor noticed Ethan looking. "My husband." Ethan nodded. "I figured." She studied him carefully for a moment. Then the smile softened. "What happened?" Ethan knew exactly what she meant. The evaluation was canceled. The words hung between them. Eleanor lowered her eyes. A quiet sadness crossed her face. "I'm so sorry." Ethan shook his head immediately. "Don't." "But if I hadn't, if we were back on that road right now, I'd still stop." The answer came too quickly to be rehearsed. It surprised both of them. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Eleanor nodded slowly. Something in her expression seemed to ease. Over the following weeks, visits became routine. At first, Ethan stopped by only to make sure she was doing well. Then he noticed a broken section of fence behind the house. The next visit, he brought tools. Another day, he repaired loose boards beneath the porch roof where rainwater had been leaking for months. When Eleanor had a follow-up cardiology appointment, Ethan drove her to Port Townsend. Valor occupied the back seat and accepted homemade dog treats as payment for his services. The arrangement suited everyone. One afternoon, while organizing boxes in the garage, Ethan discovered an old military radio sitting beneath a workbench. Dust covered most of it. The antenna hung loose. A faded label on the side read, "Thomas Brooks 1987. "It hasn't worked in years," Eleanor said. "He listened to it all the time." Ethan carried it home. 3 evenings later, he returned with the radio under one arm. "You fixed it?" "I think so." "You think so? Let's find out." The radio crackled. Static filled the room. A second later, music emerged from the speaker. An old country song drifted softly through the kitchen. Eleanor froze. The smile disappeared. Her eyes filled unexpectedly. She turned away before speaking. Thomas used to play that song every Sunday morning. Neither Ethan nor Valor moved. The music continued quietly in the background. For the first time, Ethan saw the loneliness she usually kept hidden behind humor and determination. Not dramatic grief, not fresh heartbreak, something older. a companionship space that had existed for 10 years. Later that afternoon, they sat on the back porch overlooking the garden. The radio played softly through the open kitchen window. Eleanor spoke about military life, about waiting, about birthdays celebrated through phone calls, about anniversaries missed because ships changed schedules, about staring at the driveway after midnight because a deployment was finally ending. Ethan listened. Most civilians asked about combat. Eleanor talked about absence. That felt closer to the truth. Eventually, she asked about his parents. The question arrived gently, without pressure, without curiosity, simply because she cared. For a long time, Ethan said nothing. Then words he had avoided for years began finding their way out. He told her about Syria, about the satellite call, about the funeral he never attended, about a voicemail from his mother that still existed somewhere in a drawer because he couldn't bring himself to listen to it. He spoke about PTSD, the nightmares, the sudden flashes of memory, the way loss sometimes waited quietly for months before appearing in the middle of an ordinary day. Eleanor listened without interrupting. When he finished, she simply placed a hand over his. No advice, no speech. The afternoon breeze moved through the trees. That was enough. Several days later, Ethan returned home after another visit. The house felt different, less empty. He wasn't entirely sure why. That evening, he sat down on the sofa intending to watch television. Valor settled near his feet. Rain tapped softly against the windows. At some point, Ethan closed his eyes. Hours passed. The television eventually switched itself off. Outside, the night deepened. Inside, Ethan remained asleep. There were no explosions, no gunfire, no voices pulling him back into old memories. When dawn finally arrived, sunlight was spilling across the living room floor. Valor still lay beside the couch. Ethan opened his eyes slowly. For several seconds, he simply sat there, listening, thinking, realizing. It was the first peaceful night's sleep he could remember in years. The peaceful sleep did not solve Ethan's problems. The evaluation was still gone. Operation Silent Tide was still moving toward deployment. His future remained uncertain, yet something had changed. The weight he carried no longer felt quite as lonely. The days settled into a rhythm neither Ethan nor Eleanor ever discussed. 3 mornings a week, he stopped by her house before heading back to Polsbo. Sometimes he brought groceries. Sometimes he fixed things around the property. Sometimes they simply drank coffee while Valor wandered through the backyard, inspecting squirrels, flower beds, and anything else he considered suspicious. Summer was beginning to arrive along the Washington coast. The mornings grew brighter. The evenings stretched longer. The rain appeared less often. One Thursday afternoon, Ethan was replacing a damaged porch light when Eleanor stepped outside, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. "You know," she said, handing him one, "most people would have hired an electrician. Most people would have bought a new radio too." That earned a laugh. The radio still sat on a shelf inside the kitchen. Every Sunday morning, Eleanor turned it on. Every Sunday morning, the same country station filled the house. A small tradition had quietly returned. That evening, after Ethan left, Eleanor remained on the porch, watching the road long after his truck disappeared. The house felt different now, less silent, less empty. The realization made her smile, then it made her think. Later that night, she walked to the living room bookshelf and pulled down an old address book. The pages were worn. Many names had been crossed out over the years. Some had moved away, others had passed on. One name remained, James Whitaker. Eleanor stared at it for several seconds. Then she picked up the phone. 3 days later, nearly 600 miles away, retired Rear Admiral James Whitaker sat across from her during lunch at a small seafood restaurant near Bremerton. He was 82 years old now. The years had bent his shoulders slightly. They had not diminished the sharpness in his eyes. He had served beside Thomas Brooks decades earlier. The 2 men had remained close friends until Thomas's death. Eleanor told him everything. The rain, the roadside encounter, the hospital, the missed evaluation, the canceled opportunity. James listened quietly, occasionally nodding, occasionally asking a question. When she finished, he stirred his coffee slowly. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Eleanor looked down at the table. "Nothing unfair." James waited. "I don't want special treatment." "Good. Neither would Ethan." The retired admiral nodded. That answer seemed important to him. "I just want somebody to look at the whole story." The conversation lasted another hour. No promises were made. No favors were requested. When they finally stood to leave, James placed several folded notes into his jacket pocket. "I'll make some calls," that was all he said. Over the next week, records were reviewed. Hospital reports, emergency intake forms, showing Ethan helping Eleanor through the hospital entrance, statements from nurses, confirmation from Dr. Harper. A picture began to emerge. Not of a man avoiding responsibility, of a man accepting it. Ethan knew nothing about any of it. Life continued as usual. One afternoon, he helped Eleanor trim back overgrown branches near the driveway. Another day, he drove her to Port Townsend for a follow-up appointment. The evaluation felt increasingly distant, a chapter that had already ended. Then, on a clear Wednesday morning, his phone rang. The number belonged to Naval Base Kitsap. Ethan answered immediately. The call lasted less than 4 minutes. When it ended, he remained standing beside his truck for several seconds. Valor tilted his head. The German Shepherd recognized surprise when he saw it. A slow smile appeared on Ethan's face, the first genuine smile in a very long time. The evaluation board had reviewed additional information related to the missed appointment. A special review session had been approved. Tomorrow morning, one final opportunity. If successful, Ethan and Valor could still join Operation Silent Tide before deployment. The news felt almost unreal. The first person he thought about was Eleanor. An hour later, his truck turned into her driveway. Before he could even shut off the engine, Valor jumped out and ran toward the porch. Eleanor was already sitting outside. A light blanket rested across her knees. A steaming mug of tea sat beside her. The afternoon sun painted the harbor below in shades of gold and blue. When Ethan told her what had happened, her reaction caught him off guard. Her entire face lit up. She stood so quickly the tea nearly tipped over. "Oh my goodness." Eleanor. "Oh my goodness," she laughed. Actually laughed. Then hugged him before he could react. The embrace lasted only a moment, long enough. Neither mentioned it afterward. The conversation drifted naturally through the afternoon. They talked about Port Gamble, about fishing boats, about a bakery Eleanor liked near Port Townsend, about Thomas, about Valor's growing reputation as self-appointed neighborhood security chief. For the first time in weeks, Ethan found himself laughing easily. The constant tension he carried seemed farther away. The need to prove himself felt quieter. As the sun began sinking toward the water, long shadows stretched across the yard. Eventually, Ethan stood. The drive back to Polsbo would take nearly an hour. Morning would arrive early. Before leaving, he looked at Eleanor carefully. "You've been taking your medication?" She rolled her eyes. "Yes." "Every day?" "Yes." "The heart specialist appointment next month?" "I know. And if the Taurus breaks down again?" She started laughing. "You sound exactly like Thomas." Ethan ignored the interruption. "Call roadside assistance." "Yes, sir." "Don't walk anywhere by yourself." "Ethan, I'm serious." The smile on Eleanor's face softened, because she understood. These weren't instructions, they were concern. The kind family members carried for one another. Ethan looked out across the yard. The evening breeze moved through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a boat horn echoed across the water. "I don't know how long deployment would be." His voice was quieter now. "But I'll call." Eleanor listened. "And if something happens..." The sentence never finished. It didn't need to. She recognized the expression immediately. The same expression she had seen in military spouses for decades. The same fear Thomas carried before difficult deployments. The same fear Ethan carried now. Fear of unfinished goodbyes. Fear of lost opportunities. Fear of people disappearing before another conversation could happen. She reached across and placed her hand gently over his. "Go do what you're meant to do." Her voice was soft, steady. Then she added something without thinking. "Don't worry about Mom." The word hung in the air. Both of them heard it. For a brief second, Ethan froze. Neither spoke. The evening remained perfectly still around them. Finally, Eleanor smiled. A little embarrassed, a little emotional. Ethan looked away toward the harbor. When he spoke again, his voice sounded different somehow. Softer. "Okay." A few minutes later, he climbed into the truck. Valor jumped into the back seat. The engine started. Eleanor remained standing on the porch, watching. The truck disappeared around the bend in the road and eventually vanished from sight. Only then did she sit back down. A small smile remained on her face. Inside the house, near the old radio, rested a folded notepad filled with names, phone numbers, and handwritten notes from the past several days. Ethan never saw it. He never saw the conversations. The phone calls, the effort. He had no idea that the woman waving goodbye from the porch was the very reason tomorrow's opportunity existed at all. Ethan barely slept, not because of nightmares. Those had become less frequent over the past several weeks. This time it was anticipation. The evaluation was less than 12 hours away. If everything went well, he and Valor could still join Operation Silent Tide before deployment. After nearly 2 years of medical reviews, therapy sessions, training cycles, and uncertainty, the finish line was finally visible again. Before sunrise, he was already dressed. Coffee sat untouched in the cup holder. Valor occupied the back seat. The highway south toward Naval Base Kitsap was quiet beneath a pale blue sky that hinted at another warm summer day. For once, everything seemed to be lining up. The traffic lights along State Route 104 turned green one after another. The roads were clear. The timing was perfect. Then his phone rang. The call came from a number he didn't recognize. Ethan almost ignored it. Almost. He pressed the answer button. A woman's voice came through immediately, panicked. Breathing hard. "Ethan, this is Carol Jensen. I live 2 houses down from Eleanor." His grip tightened around the steering wheel. "What happened?" "I found her in the garden." The words arrived all at once. She had collapsed while watering flowers. Someone had called 911. The ambulance was already there. Paramedics were loading her into the vehicle. "We thought you should know." For several seconds, Ethan couldn't speak. The road stretched ahead toward the base. Straight, clear, simple. Then memories began arriving from places he usually kept locked away. A funeral he never attended. A satellite connection freezing halfway through a service. His mother's photograph beside a casket. The voicemail he still hadn't listened to. Loss had a way of returning through unexpected doors. Valor suddenly stood up. The movement caught Ethan's attention. The German Shepherd stared through the side window toward the highway leading back to Port Gamble, completely alert, waiting. The traffic light ahead changed from red to green. Cars began moving. Ethan remained still. The evaluation, the deployment, the future he had spent 2 years chasing. Everything sat on one side of the scale. A 76-year-old woman in the back of an ambulance sat on the other. The decision took less than a second. His hand turned the wheel. The truck moved left, away from the base, toward Port Gamble. While driving, he called the evaluation office. The administrator who answered sounded stunned. "You've got to be kidding." "I wish I was." "Ethan, the board is already assembled." "I know." Silence filled the line, then a long sigh. "We'll document it." That was all she could promise. 40 minutes later, Ethan arrived at Jefferson Healthcare Medical Center. The emergency department waiting area smelled faintly of coffee, disinfectant, and damp jackets. Valor settled beside a row of chairs. People occasionally glanced toward the dog. Nobody approached. Ethan spent nearly an hour watching the double doors leading deeper into the hospital. Eventually, a physician emerged. Dr. Laura Bennett, early 60s, calm voice, kind eyes. "Ethan?" He stood immediately. "How is she?" "She's awake." The answer loosened something in his chest. Dr. Bennett reviewed the situation. A cardiac rhythm disturbance had caused Eleanor to lose consciousness. The episode had been serious enough to require emergency intervention. Fortunately, neighbors noticed quickly. The ambulance arrived quickly. Treatment started quickly. Timing mattered, as it often did. A short time later, Ethan entered Eleanor's room. She looked annoyed. That was the first sign she was feeling better. The second was the way she immediately pointed at him. "What are you doing here?" Ethan stopped beside the bed. "You collapsed. You had an evaluation. So did you." "Mine wasn't scheduled." The argument continued for several minutes. Neither seemed interested in surrendering. Finally, Eleanor folded her arms. "You should have gone." "I wasn't leaving, Ethan." "No." The answer came firmly enough to end the discussion. For a while, they sat quietly. The heart monitor beeped steadily beside the bed. Sunlight filtered through the blinds. Valor rested near the doorway, watching everything. Then Eleanor spoke again. Softer this time. "This is my fault." Ethan frowned. "No, it is." "No, it isn't." Her eyes moved toward the window. "I called people." That got his attention. "What people?" Eleanor hesitated. The explanation emerged slowly. The phone calls, the meetings, James Whitaker, the records, the hospital documentation. The requests for the board to review what actually happened on that rainy morning. Ethan listened without interrupting. By the time she finished, the room felt strangely quiet. "You did all that?" Eleanor nodded. I wanted them to know the truth. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm. Neither spoke. Ethan looked down at his hands. For years, most of his relationships had existed inside military structures. Commanders, teammates, professionals, people connected by duty. The woman sitting in front of him had spent weeks working behind the scenes simply because she cared what happened to him. No obligation, no requirement, no expectation of recognition, just care. His throat tightened unexpectedly. He looked away toward the window. Outside, a ferry moved slowly across the water. For a long moment, he couldn't find words. The emotional walls he had spent years building rarely cracked. This time they did, completely. Images moved through his mind. His father teaching him to drive. His mother waving goodbye from the front porch. The funeral he missed. The years afterward. The distance he kept between himself and everyone else. The fear that loving people guaranteed losing them. Eleanor reached across the bed rail and touched his arm. A simple gesture, nothing dramatic. It was enough. When Ethan finally spoke, his voice sounded rough. You didn't have to do any of that. I know. Then why? Eleanor smiled gently. The answer arrived without hesitation. Because somebody should have. The room grew quiet again. Neither seemed uncomfortable with the silence. After a while, Ethan looked at her. Really looked. The woman who had entered his life because of a storm. The woman who listened without judgment. The woman who somehow understood parts of him he rarely explained. For the first time in many years, a word escaped before he could stop it. Mom. Eleanor froze. The monitor continued its steady beeping. Tears immediately filled her eyes. Not dramatic tears. The kind that arrive when something unexpected finds a place it belongs. Neither tried to say anything else. There wasn't much left to say. Outside the hospital window, the afternoon sunlight spread across the water. Inside the room, 3 lives that had spent years moving through loneliness sat quietly together. And for the first time, Ethan no longer felt like he was facing the future alone. 3 months later, autumn colors had begun appearing across western Washington. The evaluation board finally met with Ethan again. This time, the conversation felt different. The reports showed measurable improvement. The therapist noted stability. The medical reviews remained positive. More importantly, the board saw a man who no longer measured his value solely through deployment schedules and operational readiness. He had found balance, something many operators spent entire careers searching for. Several weeks later, Ethan received official approval to return to service, not as a frequently deployed operator, not as someone constantly rotating overseas. Instead, he would serve as a tactical K-9 instructor and operational advisor at a facility close enough to remain in Washington. The assignment fit the life he had now. One warm afternoon near the end of summer, Ethan drove to Port Gamble carrying a folder beneath his arm. Eleanor was sitting on the porch when he arrived. Valor immediately walked over and rested his head on her knee. Ethan handed her the folder. She adjusted her glasses and opened it. Several forms sat inside: legal paperwork, dependent care documentation, emergency contact authorizations. Eleanor looked confused. Then she looked up. Ethan took a slow breath. I can't get my parents back. The words came quietly. But if you're willing. He paused. The harbor breeze moved through the trees. I'd like to spend the rest of my life calling you Mom. For a second, Eleanor simply stared at him. Then tears appeared. Real ones this time. The kind that could not be hidden. She reached for his hand. Valor remained exactly where he was. The late afternoon sun spread across the garden. Around them, flowers moved gently in the wind, and in a small house overlooking the Washington coast, 3 souls who had spent years carrying loneliness in different ways finally found something that looked a lot like home. Not through blood, not through obligation, through a series of ordinary choices made when kindness would have been easier to ignore. What stayed with me most about this story wasn't the evaluation board, the military paperwork, or even the second chance Ethan received. It was something much smaller. It was an old woman sitting on a porch with a blanket across her knees. It was a dog who remembered a house after visiting it only once. It was a cup of tea growing cold, while 2 people talked about ordinary things that somehow mattered more than they realized. The older I get, the more I notice how much of life happens in those quiet spaces. A phone call answered at the right moment. A driveway someone pulls into one more time. A chair left empty at the table. A voice asking if you've eaten. Small things that don't seem important until one day they are. I think many of us know what it's like to carry old regrets. Maybe it's a conversation we never had. Maybe it's someone we meant to visit one more time. Maybe it's a loss that never quite left us. Yet every now and then, life gives us another chance to show up for somebody. Sometimes that chance arrives disguised as an inconvenience, a delay, or a change of plans. And sometimes, if we're paying attention, it feels a little like grace. If this story reminded you of someone you've loved, missed, worried about, or been grateful for, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. Feel free to share a memory, a prayer, or simply where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy grounded stories about loyalty, resilience, and human connection, please consider liking the video and subscribing. While this story is fictional, the loneliness, kindness, second chances, and unexpected families at its heart are experiences many real people carry every day. Tonight, somewhere along a quiet road, a porch light will still be glowing for someone who hasn't come home yet. And sometimes I think those lights matter more than we realize.